Well, the Pachamama Alliance is the kind of incubator for 4 Years Go. And prior to the Pachamama Alliance, I was involved for 20 years as an executive with something called the Hunger Project. And I worked in sub-Saharan Africa, India, and Bangladesh on the eradication of hunger and poverty. And that was really my life's work until I had an experience, a very profound, really spiritual, outside of the norm experience with a shaman in Guatemala, where I saw faces of indigenous people with orange geometric face paint on their faces and yellow, red, and black feather crowns, men, in a vision floating up from the vast unending forest of green from the forest floor towards a giant bird, which I had become in this vision. And I was flying in slow motion over a vast, vast forest of green, and these disembodied faces of men started floating up from the forest floor with this face paint and these feather crowns and speaking in a strange tongue to the bird. And as the bird, I was mesmerized, I was fascinated, but didn't understand what the voices were saying. And then at a certain point, I came out of the trance that I was in, didn't even know I was in a trance, really in the company of a very powerful shaman in Guatemala. It was my first shamanic experience. This is 1994. And then I was there with a group of people, one of whom is John Perkins, who's now a close friend and colleague, who actually accompanied me and these other people to Guatemala. And he told me, well, those faces, those people, I know them. They're from the Achuar tribe in southeastern Ecuador, and they're a very remote indigenous group, and they're calling for you to come to them. They're calling for me to come to them. I know that they're ready for contact. So out of my relationship with John Perkins and his knowledge of the Achuar people in Ecuador, he and I organized a group of 12 people, including my husband Bill, to visit the Achuar. They weren't uncontacted, but they had been isolated for thousands of years by design and had decided to initiate contact with the modern world, something that they feared, but realized that if they initiated on their own terms before contact came in ways they couldn't control, that they would be ready when the danger came, which they knew would eventually, ultimately, inevitably come. So that's a long way of answering your question, how I got involved. But so this encounter that we had with the Achuar people way back in 1995, my husband Bill and I, and John Perkins, and then a handful of other people, really was the foundation, the beginning, the seed, the origin of the Pachamama Alliance. The word Pachamama means Mother Earth, and it's an alliance between indigenous peoples of the Amazon and conscious, committed people from the modern world, working together to preserve the sustainability and future of life itself. And so after that encounter with the Achuar people of Ecuador deep in the Amazon rainforest, I began to realize that the next chapter of my life was about that. And it took me a while to complete my very, very devoted and committed work with the Hunger Project. I was helped by getting malaria, which sort of felled me. I couldn't do anything for anyone. And it gave me, in many ways, the blessing of contemplative time. I was sick for about a year, to really see it was time for this transition. And the Pachamama Alliance was really born out of that experience. John Perkins, the great author and shaman himself, and my husband Bill Twist, who at that time was a businessman, and myself, who was an executive with this vast NGO called the Hunger Project, we co-founded the Pachamama Alliance in 1995. And so out of the Pachamama Alliance, which is really our work with the Achuar, the Shuar, the Shiwiar, the Kayapo, the Uwa, the Kero, the Quichuas, the Zapro people, the Waorani people, all these indigenous groups throughout the Amazon, it became clear to them that the most important work we could do besides standing with them and for them to protect their lands and culture not just for themselves, but for the future of life on Earth. That the real pressure came from what they call the dream of the modern world. A dream that's becoming a nightmare for ourselves in all forms of life. A dream rooted in consumption and acquisition, and greed and accumulation. And so they told us the most important thing we could do is work to transform or change the dream of the modern world to one that's a dream or a vision of an environmentally sustainable, spiritually fulfilling, and socially just human presence on this planet. And so out of that mandate from Indigenous people, we created the Awakening the Dreamer, Change the Dream Symposium Program, which is an educational program that's now in 58 countries as I sit here with you. And then that work, which is very, very powerful and all over the world now, gave birth to 4 Years Go. And 4 Years Go is really a media, commitment, communications, education campaign on a very broad scale to awaken people to the little-known fact that 2011, 2012, 2013, and 2014 could be the 4-year period when we turn the tide, when we create a positive tipping point away from an inhospitable, dangerous, unsustainable, really violent future towards which we're clearly headed, and shift that trajectory towards a sustainable, hospitable, nourishing, peaceful future. Not that we resolve everything, but that we take our initiative and will to turn the tide of history away from that future and towards a positive future, generate a positive tipping point, really catalyzed by the climate change crisis, which has a window of time and no one knows how long it is, but that window, that pressure to move the dial before it's too late, before things become irreversible, is a real blessing for humanity to get with it, to amplify, to step up, to take a stand. And so the 4 Years Go commitment campaign really communicates that the next 4 years, the choices we make in the next 4 years, could determine, and probably will determine, the future of life on Earth for the next 1,000. And to live in the responsibility of 1,000 years by recognizing the choices we make in these next 4 years will determine that future. So it's a very, very exciting campaign, and it came really originally from the rainforest, from the Indigenous people who counseled us to change the dream of the modern world. And in working to change the dream of the modern world through the symposium, the Awaken the Dreamer program, we realized it needs to move faster, with more power, with more will, and we need to make that shift in this very precious time period.